Commanders: General Henry H. Hap Arnold, Commanding General, U.S. Army Air Forces. Brigadier General Larry Norstad, Chief of Staff, 20th Air Force. Brigadier General Haywood S. Possum Hansel Jr., Commander, XXI Bomber Command, October 1944 to January 1945. Major General Curtis E. LeMay, Commander, XXI Bomber Command, January 1945 to August 1945. Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell Jr., Commander, 73rd Bombardment Wing. Brigadier General Thomas S. Tommy Power, Commander, 314th Bombardment Wing. Brigadier General August Kistner, LeMay's Chief of Staff. St. Clair McKelway, LeMay's Public Relations Officer. Colonel Paul W. Tibbets Jr., Commander, 509 Composite Group, Pilot, Enola Gay. Captain Robert A. Lewis, Co-Pilot, Enola Gay. Major Thomas W. Farabee Bombardier, Enola Gay. Captain Theodore Dutch Van Kirk, Navigator, Enola Gay. Captain William S. Deke Parson, U.S. Navy, Weaponeer, Enola Gay. Second Lieutenant Morris R. Jepson, Assistant Weaponeer, Enola Gay. First Lieutenant Jacob Baser, Radar Countermeasures Officer. Flew both atomic missions. Technical Sergeant Wyatt E. Dusenbury, Flight Engineer, Enola Gay. Staff Sergeant George Bob R. Karen, Tail Gunner, Enola Gay. Captain Robert A. Lewis, Co-Pilot, Enola Gay. Major Charles W. Sweeney, Pilot, Boxcar, Nagasaki, August 9, 1945. Captain Kermit K. Bean Bombardier Boxcar. Commander Frederick Ashworth, U.S. Navy. Weaponeer, Boxcar. Major George Marquardt, Aircraft Commander, Necessary Evil. Second Lieutenant Russell Gackenbach, Navigator, Necessary Evil. Photograph Hiroshima Mushroom Cloud. Staff Sergeant Carl Barthold, Radio Operator, B-29 Starduster, Saipan. Richard Bale, Aircrew, 9th Bombardment Group. Harold Madsen, Bombardier/Navigator, multiple Tokyo fire raids. Colonel Henry A. Byrode, built Chinese airfields for B-29 operations. Time, November 1944 to August 1945. Dates: First operational raid, June 15, 1944, first Tokyo strike. November 24, 1944, Operation Meeting House. March 9 to 10, 1945, Hiroshima. August 6, 1945, Nagasaki. August 9, 1945. Locations: Boeing Field, Seattle Smoky Hill Army Airfield, Kansas Saipan, Isley Field Guam, Northfield Tinian, Northfield Tokyo, Japan, Hiroshima, Japan. Weather: Meeting House, 25-knot surface winds over Tokyo, enabling fire spread Hiroshima. Clear skies, visibility unlimited. Units involved: 20th Air Force, XXI Bomber Command, 73rd Bombardment Wing, Saipan, 313th Bombardment Wing, Tinian, 314th Bombardment Wing, Guam, 9th Bombardment Group, 500 Bomb Group, 509th Composite Group. In the summer of 1943, inside a Boeing factory in Seattle, engineers were building an airplane that had never really been built before. Not because the design was impossible, but because everything about it pushed past the edge of what anyone knew how to do. The B-29 Superfortress was not simply a larger bomber. It was a pressurized, remote-controlled, radar-equipped machine designed to fly higher and farther than any bomber in history. At every stage of its construction, it came apart in ways nobody had anticipated. Engines caught fire on the test stand. Wiring overheated. Wings that looked perfect on paper cracked under stress. General Henry H. Hap Arnold, the man who had staked the entire strategic case for an independent air force on this one aircraft, sat in Washington and watched the delays pile up with mounting dread. Arnold was not a patient man, and what was happening in Seattle was testing every limit he had. He had promised President Roosevelt a weapon that could reach the Japanese home islands from bases thousands of miles away, a weapon that could end the war without an invasion that military planners privately estimated could cost 1 million American lives. But the B-29 was hemorrhaging time and money, and the men who flew the early test versions came back with stories that were difficult to hear. Curtis LeMay, who would later command the entire bombing campaign, recalled that the airplane had as many bugs as the entomological department of the Smithsonian. One engine variant had a habit of simply catching fire at altitude, and there was no reliable way to put out. Test pilot Edmund Allen and his entire crew died over Seattle in February 1943 when an engine fire consumed the wing. Arnold attended the funerals. He kept building the airplane anyway. By the spring of 1944, the first operational B-29s were arriving in India, where they would fly from primitive bases in Bengal to targets in Japanese-occupied China. The plan was called Operation Matterhorn, and it was, in almost every practical sense, an impossibility. Every gallon of fuel, every spare part, every bomb had to be flown over the Himalayan mountains. The route crews called the hump in cargo aircraft before a single B-29 could take off for Japan. Colonel Henry Byroad had built airfields in China using 500,000 Chinese laborers working with hand tools and wicker baskets, completing in 90 days what American engineers said would take years. When the strips were finished, Byroad stood at the edge of one of them and simply shook his head. It was almost unbelievable, he said quietly, what was accomplished, but the math was brutal. It took 6 tanker flights over the hump to put enough fuel on the ground for one B-29 combat mission. The campaign was burning itself alive before it had truly started. The first raid on the Japanese home islands launched on June 15, 1944. 68 B-29s aimed at the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yalta. It was a moment Arnold had worked toward for years, and when the first reports came back, he read them carefully and said nothing for a long time. 47 aircraft had reached the target. The bombs were scattered. Damage was minimal. 7 B-29s had been lost, not all to enemy fire. One had simply vanished somewhere over the sea. The crews who returned were exhausted in a way that went beyond normal fatigue. They had flown through weather systems that tossed a 60-ton airplane like a piece of paper over a mountain that reached 5 miles into the sky, to drop bombs that had barely scratched their target. A navigator who had survived a mission sat on the edge of a cot that night and stared at his hands for a long time before he could sleep. If anyone said the mission was a success, nobody believed it. Salvation came from an unexpected direction. A chain of small volcanic islands in the Central Pacific called the Marianas. American Marines stormed ashore at Saipan in June 1944 and fought for the island inch by bloody inch through jungle heat that killed men as efficiently as Japanese bullets. When it was over, engineers arrived and began doing something that transformed the entire logic of the Pacific War. They built runways, long ones, long enough for B-29s. From Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, a B-29 could reach Tokyo in roughly 6 hours and return. No more Himalayan crossings. No more impossible supply chains. On October 12, 1944, a B-29 named Jolton Josie the Pacific Screamer touched down at Isley Field on Saipan, the first superfortress in the Marianas. The ground crew chief, Bud Lonigan, walked around the aircraft afterward with his hand on the fuselage as if reassuring himself it was real. "We trained together," he said to nobody in particular. "We lived together. We prayed together." The war, everyone felt, had just changed shape. The man Arnold chose to lead the bombing campaign from the Marianas was Brigadier General Haywood Possum Hansel, a soft-spoken Southerner who believed with genuine intellectual conviction that precision daylight bombing could end the war without burning Japanese cities to the ground. Hansel was not naive. He understood that people would die, but he believed that targeting factories, shipyards, and aircraft plants with accuracy was both more effective and more defensible than simply setting cities on fire. He arrived on Saipan with detailed target lists and a clear doctrine, and on November 24, 1944, he launched the first B-29 strike against Tokyo itself. 111 aircraft aimed at the Musashino Aircraft Engine Factory on the city's northwestern edge. Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell flew the lead aircraft, a B-29 named Dauntless Dottie, and when he reached Tokyo, he looked down at the capital of the Japanese Empire through the bombardier's window and felt something he later struggled to describe. "You realize," he said afterward, "that this is real. What O'Donnell could not fight, and what Hansel had not fully anticipated, was the jet stream. At 30,000 feet over Japan, winds exceeded 250 miles an hour, winds so powerful that a B-29 flying into them was barely moving over ground, and one fly with them was traveling so fast that the bomb site became essentially useless. The November 24th raid sent 111 aircraft to Tokyo. 24 bombs hit the target. The factory was barely scratched. Hansel flew back to Saipan and stared at the reconnaissance photographs for a long time. He adjusted his approach. He tried again. The results were similar. Through December and into January 1945, he launched raid after raid, and each time the photographs came back showing the same thing: bombs scattered across empty fields, factories standing intact, Japan's industrial capacity essentially untouched. He was running out of time, and he knew it, though he did not know exactly how little he had left. If anyone on his staff tried to reassure him, he stopped them. "Don't," he said quietly one evening. "Just don't." On January 6, 1945, a transport aircraft landed on Guam, and Brigadier General Laurie's Norstad stepped off. He had flown from Washington, and the reason for the trip was not something that required much explanation once Hansel saw his face. Norstad had known Hansel for years. Their families had dined together before the war. He did not enjoy what he had come to do, and he did not pretend otherwise. He told Hansel that Arnold had lost confidence in the precision bombing approach, that the results were insufficient, and that Major General Curtis LeMay was being transferred from China to take command. Hansel listened without interrupting. When Norstad finished, there was a silence between them that lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. Hansel finally said, "I understand." He did not say anything else. LeMay's transport landed 2 hours later, and the two men stood on the runway in the jungle heat and shook hands. Whatever either of them was thinking in that moment, neither one wrote it down. If you like what you've seen so far, please like and subscribe. This story is only just beginning. LeMay arrived in the Pacific with a reputation built on results and a manner that discouraged conversation. He was 38 years old, heavy-set, with a jaw that seemed permanently clenched, and he had a habit of studying problems in complete silence before saying anything at all, a habit his staff had learned not to interrupt. McKelway, his public relations officer, later wrote that there was something deeply, bottomlessly disturbing in the stocky, plain-looking new commanding general. LeMay read through Hansel's mission reports, studied the reconnaissance photographs, examined the weather data, and sat with the problem of the jet stream for several days. The precision bombing approach was not failing because the crews were inadequate or the aircraft were unreliable. It was failing because the physics of the atmosphere over Japan made it nearly impossible for a bomb released at 30,000 feet to land where it was aimed. He turned the problem over in his mind every way he could, and the answer he arrived at was one that shocked nearly everyone around him when he finally said out loud. He was going to fly lower, much lower, at night, without guns, with incendiaries instead of high explosives. He would send the B-29s in at between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, low enough that anti-aircraft fire would be far more accurate, low enough that any Japanese night fighter that found them could destroy them without difficulty, stripped of their defensive armament to carry more bombs, navigating by the fires already burning below them. His intelligence officers ran the calculations and came back to him with an estimated loss rate of 70%. LeMay looked at the number and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Schedule the mission." The target was Tokyo. The date was March 9th, 1945. What happened that night would become the single most destructive air raid in human history, and the men who flew it went to their aircraft on the afternoon of March 9th, not knowing if they would come back at all. On the afternoon of March 9th, 1945, Staff Sergeant Carl Barthold walked through the crew quarters at Isley Field on Saipan and found his crewmate sitting on the edge of his bunk with his B-4 bag open in front of him. The man was going through his possessions slowly, one by one, a photograph, a letter, a small worn Bible, setting each one down with the careful attention of someone who believed he was looking at these things for the last time. Barthold stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. He did not say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. The briefing had made the situation plain enough. They were going in low, at night, over Tokyo, without half their guns. Every man on every crew had done the arithmetic in his own way, and the arithmetic kept coming out the same. Barthold picked up his flight bag, checked his equipment one more time, and walked out to the flight line. At 5:36 in the afternoon, Brigadier General Thomas Power climbed into the lead B-29 and started his engines. Power was commanding the mission in the air, while LeMay remained on the ground. LeMay could not fly combat, could not risk capture, because he alone among the commanders in the Pacific knew what was coming after the firebombing campaign was over. He knew about the atomic bomb. So he stood beside Brigadier General August Kistner at the edge of the runway in a jeep as the first B-29s began their takeoff rolls, one after another, the sound building until it was less a sound than a physical pressure against the chest. 334 aircraft. From Saipan, from Tinian, from Guam. The runway lights stretched into the dark, and the bombers disappeared into the Pacific night one by one, and LeMay watched every one of them go. He did not speak. Kistner did not speak either. There was nothing to add to what was already in the air. Power reached the Japanese coast at low altitude and began his bomb run over Tokyo at 12 minutes past midnight. The city below him was dark. The blackout was in effect. The streets empty, 2 million people asleep or lying awake in the darkness listening for something they could not yet hear. Power's bombardier released the first load of M69 incendiary clusters, and within minutes the fires had started. The wind was blowing at 25 knots across the surface of the city, a dry winter wind that moved through the paper and with construction of Tokyo's working-class districts with a speed and completeness that nobody in the planning rooms had quite predicted. By the time the second wave of B-29s arrived, the fires from the first wave were visible from 60 miles out at sea. The crews and the trailing formations did not need their navigation equipment. They followed the light. Richard Bale, flying with the 9th Bombardment Group in the rear of the formation, came over Tokyo and looked down into something that did not resemble anything he had a name for. The entire horizon to the north was orange. The smoke rose so high that it reached its altitude and beyond, and inside the smoke there was an orange glow that pulsed and shifted as the wind moved through it. The heat coming up from the fires below was strong enough to throw the B-29 upward in violent thermal updrafts that made the aircraft impossible to hold level, and the smell, a smell that penetrated the pressurized fuselage and got into the clothing of every man aboard, was something none of them had encountered before and none of them ever forgot. Bale later said, simply, that he could almost have read a newspaper by the light coming up from the city below. He said it quietly, without emphasis. As a man states a fact he would prefer not to think about too deeply. The crews coming in behind the lead formations found navigation stripped down to its most elemental form. The fires below them were the target. The radio channels filled with voices, clipped professional controlled, as pilots called out positions and altitudes and confirmed their bomb release points. But underneath the professionalism there was something else running through every transmission, something that nobody acknowledged directly because there was no framework available for acknowledging it. Harold Madsen, a bombardier and navigator who flew 2 of the Tokyo fire raids, said afterward, the whole city was on fire. You could see flames for 100 miles or so. He paused when he said it, the way a man pauses when he's trying to decide whether what he is describing is something a listener can actually understand. The whole city, he said again, as if the repetition might help. On the ground below, in the Shitamachi district of eastern Tokyo, the oldest, most densely packed part of the city, where the working-class neighborhoods ran together in an unbroken mesh of wooden houses and paper screens, a 14-year-old named Katsumoto Sodome was pulled from sleep by the sound of the air raid sirens and the smell of smoke. He ran with his family into the street and found the sky on fire. The wind was moving burning debris through the air in streams, landing on rooftops and paper screens and dried winter wood, and the fires were joining and growing faster than any bucket brigade or fire crew could address. Sodome ran. He ran through streets where the asphalt itself was beginning to soften from the heat, past canals where people were standing waist-deep in the water trying to breathe, past neighbors who were simply sitting down in the street because they had nowhere left to go. Decades later, Sodome would found an entire museum dedicated to what happened that night. He would spend the rest of his life making sure nobody forgot it. On the night itself, he was simply a boy running through fire. Power landed back on Guam after 15 hours and 4 minutes in the air. He taxied to the hard stand and shut the engines down and sat in the cockpit for a moment before he moved. When he climbed down from the aircraft, LeMay was waiting on the tarmac. Power had dark circles beneath his eyes, and his face had the particular flatness of extreme exhaustion. LeMay studied him for a moment. There was, McKelway wrote later, a hint of a smile on LeMay's face, not triumph, not satisfaction exactly, but the expression of a man who had made a decision in the dark and was only now finding out whether it had been right. Power gave him the report. Anti-aircraft fire had been lighter than expected. No Japanese night fighters had appeared in force. 14 aircraft had been lost. Not the 70% the intelligence officers had predicted, but 4%. The fires had been, Power said quietly, more complete than anyone had imagined possible. LeMay nodded once and walked back to the operations building to begin planning the next mission. Arnold's message arrived from Washington the following morning. This shows your crews have the guts for anything. LeMay read it, set it down, and picked up his target list. Between March 9th and March 19th, he sent his B-29s against Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya again. 5 major raids in 10 days that burned out 32 square miles of Japan's most important industrial cities. When the incendiary stocks ran low and he was forced to pause, he sat with his staff and looked at the reconnaissance photographs spreading across the table and calculated what was left to burn. Then he picked up his pen and drafted a request to Arnold for more bombs. He needed to keep going. He could not afford to stop. If you've been watching this story unfold, please take a moment to like and subscribe. What comes next changed everything. Through April, May, June, and into the summer of 1945, the B-29s would turn again and again to the skies over Japan, and the list of targets grew shorter with each mission until LeMay told Arnold, with a matter-of-factness that concealed whatever he actually felt, that by the end of September there would be nothing left worth bombing. Emperor Hirohito toured the ruins of eastern Tokyo in the weeks after Meeting House. He moved through what had been the Shitamachi district in a motorcade, and the people who saw him, those who remained, bowed as he passed. The 16 square miles that had burned on the night of March 9th to 10th were now a blackened plain of ash and rubble and the occasional standing chimney, stretching in every direction to the horizon. 100,000 people had died in a single night. 1 million had been made homeless. Hirohito looked at it for a long time. What passed through his mind in that moment is not recorded. What is recorded is that Japanese military commanders, watching his face, understood that something in the calculus of the war had shifted, that the emperor was no longer certain the fight could be won, and that even if it could be won, the cost of winning it was becoming something that could not be spoken aloud in polite company. By the beginning of August 1945, 67 Japanese cities had been burned. The B-29s had destroyed 178 square miles of urban Japan. More destruction than all German cities combined had suffered throughout the entire European war. 371 B-29s had been lost. The crews of those aircraft who survived the crash only to be captured faced execution, torture, and in documented cases, far worse. LeMay knew what was happening to his men in Japanese captivity, and he kept sending missions anyway, because the alternative, a land invasion of the Japanese home islands, would, in the calculations of every planner who had studied it, kill more Americans and more Japanese than the bombing campaign could ever equal. He did not sleep well. He did not say so publicly. He kept planning. And somewhere on the island of Tinian, in a set of air-conditioned assembly buildings guarded by armed sentries, a small group of men from the 509 Composite Group were making preparations for a mission that only a handful of people on Earth knew anything about. On the evening of August 5th, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets walked across the hard stand at Northfield on Tinian and stood beneath the nose of a B-29 that had not yet been given a name. He had a stencil and a pot of paint, and he painted the name himself in black block letters just below the pilot's window. He named it after his mother, Enola Gay. It was a quiet thing to do on a night that would become one of the most documented in human history, and Tibbets did it without ceremony, without speech, without anyone gathering to watch. When he was done, he stood back and looked at it for a moment. Then he went to the briefing room. In one pocket, he carried a lucky cigarette case his mother had given him. In another pocket, he carried 12 cyanide capsules. one for each member of his crew, because the nature of the mission was such that capture could not be permitted under any circumstances. He did not mention the capsules at the briefing. The briefing for the Hiroshima mission began at midnight. Tibbet stood before his 12 crew members. Many had trained personally, many had selected from across the entire Army Air Forces for their skill and their steadiness, and told them what they were carrying. He had rehearsed how to say it. He told them that the weapon aboard Enola Gay was a single bomb with a destructive power of 20,000 tons of TNT. He told them that no formation of conventional bombers dropping conventional explosives could equal what one aircraft was about to deliver in a single pass. He looked at their faces as he spoke. Captain Robert Lewis, the co-pilot who had been displaced from command of his own aircraft by Tibbets and was not fully reconciled to it, sat in the front row and said nothing. Major Thomas Farabee, the bombardier, listened with the focused attention of a man translating information directly into action. Captain Theodore Van Kirk, the navigator, made a small note on his pad. Most of the crew simply sat and looked at Tibbets in the particular silence of men who have just been told something that does not fit inside any existing category. At 2:45 in the morning of August 6, 1945, Tibbets started Enola Gay's engines. The aircraft was overloaded. The bomb alone weighed nearly 10,000 pounds, and the takeoff roll used almost the entire length of the runway before the wheels lifted. Van Kirk plotted a course north by northwest from Tinian toward the Japanese coast, 1,500 miles and 6 hours away. Somewhere in the darkness behind them, two other B-29s were flying the same course, Major Sweeney and the great artiste, carrying scientific instruments, and Major George Marquardt in Necessary Evil, carrying cameras. Second Lieutenant Russell Gackenbach, the navigator aboard Necessary Evil, sat at a station in the dark and watched the instruments and thought about what lay at the end of the route. He had been told what the bomb could do. He was not certain, in any deep sense, that he believed it, not because the information was implausible, but because the scale of it was beyond what a human mind absorbs easily while sitting in an airplane in the dark. At altitude, somewhere over the Pacific, Captain William Deke Parsons moved from his seat and climbed down into the bomb bay with Second Lieutenant Morris Jepson. Parsons was a Navy captain, a weapons expert, the man responsible for a little boy from the moment it had left the assembly building. He had insisted on arming the bomb in flight rather than on the ground. 3 B-29s had crashed on takeoff in recent weeks. An armed atomic weapon on a runway of a fully loaded airfield was not a risk he was willing to accept. He worked in a cramped, unheated bomb bay by feel and flashlight, inserting components that would allow the weapon to function, his hands steady and precise despite the cold. Jepson watched him and handed him tools when he asked for them. When it was done, Parsons climbed back up to the cabin and told Tibbets quietly that the bomb was armed. Tibbets nodded and kept flying. The Japanese coast appeared below them at dawn, gray and green through broken cloud, and Tibbets came over the intercom and told the crew to put on their protective goggles and prepare for the bomb run. Farabee moved into position at the northern bomb site and began searching the ground below for the target marker, the T-shaped AOI bridge at the center of Hiroshima, where the Oder River split and rejoined in a configuration that was visible from altitude and unmistakable. The city was clear beneath them. Visibility was unlimited. Hiroshima had been spared the firebombing campaign almost entirely. It was being preserved, though its residents did not know this, and from 31,000 feet it appeared intact and ordinary, a medium-sized Japanese city on a river delta going about its morning. It was 8:15 in the morning local time. The streets below were full of people on their way to work, to school, to market. Farabee pressed his eye to the site and searched and then said, simply and without drama, "I've got it." The bomb fell for 43 seconds. Inside Enola Gay, Tibbets had already banked the aircraft into the sharp diving turn that Van Kirk had calculated would carry them away from the blast radius as fast as possible. The crew sat in their positions and counted seconds without speaking. Staff Sergeant George Caron, the tail gunner, was turned backward in his position, watching the target point through the tail glass. Jepson had pulled the safety plugs from the weapon 30 minutes earlier, and now sat with nothing to do but wait. Parsons watched the altimeter. Lewis, in the co-pilot seat, gripped the controls and said nothing. At 8:15 and 17 seconds Japan time, Little Boy reached the predetermined altitude above the city and detonated. The light came first, a light that Karen, looking directly at it through his goggles, later described as something beyond any reference point he had. Then the shock wave reached them, rocking the aircraft hard enough that several crew members grabbed their armrests instinctively, and then the second shock wave, reflected from the ground, hit them from below. Karen pressed his face to the tail glass and saw it forming, a column of smoke and fire that was rising faster than seemed physically possible, boiling upward and outward, changing color as it rose from orange to red to a dark, churning purple-black. He had his camera. He took photographs because that was his assigned task, and because focusing on the task was the only way to manage what he was looking at. Below where the column was rising, where Hiroshima had been, there was nothing recognizable. The city had not burned. It had simply ceased to exist in any form that corresponded to what the word city means. Aboard Necessary Evil, Gackenbach pressed against his window and stared at the mushroom cloud climbing past him and kept climbing, and for a long time he could not speak. When he finally said something, he said, "We were awestruck. We didn't know what to say or do or anything." He was 22 years old. On the ground below, in the instant of the detonation, and in the minutes and hours that followed, 70,000 people died. Thousands more would die in the following weeks and months from radiation exposure. The hypocenter, the point directly below the detonation, was a hospital. The surrounding city for a radius of nearly 2 miles ceased to exist as structure. People closer to the blast were not killed by fire or concussion. They were simply gone, their shadows burned into the stone surfaces behind them by a flash of thermal energy that lasted less than a second. Those farther out who survived the initial blast found themselves in a city of fire with no landmarks, no streets they recognized, no hospital that was still standing. They walked away from the center because there was nothing else to do, and some of them walked for a very long time before they found anything that had not burned. 3 days later, on August 9th, Major Charles Sweeney flew boxguard in Nagasaki with Commander Frederick Ashworth as his weaponeer and Captain Kermit Behan at the bomb site. The primary target that day was Kokura, but smoke and haze obscured it after 3 full bomb runs, and Sweeney diverted to the secondary target. Behan found a hole in the clouds over Nagasaki and dropped Fat Man through it. 40,000 people died immediately. Jacob Baser, the radar countermeasures officer who had flown on Enola Gay 3 days earlier, sat at a station aboard Boxcar and listened to his equipment and said nothing. He was the only man who flew on both atomic missions, and he spent the rest of his long life trying to explain to people who had not been there what it meant to have been there, not what it felt like, because that was not something language reached, but simply what it meant in the factual sense to have been present at both ends of the event that ended the Second World War. Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945. The formal instruments were signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd. The B-29 Superfortress had burned 67 Japanese cities, delivered 2 atomic weapons, and, in the judgment of men like Prince Fumimaro Kono, who testified after the war that the bombing campaign drove the decision to seek peace, broken something inside the Japanese war leadership that no other force had reached. LeMay said afterward, with a directness that made people either respect him or recoil from him, "No matter how you slice it, you're going to kill an awful lot of civilians." He did not say it as an excuse. He said it as a fact, the kind of fact that a man states when he has decided that evasion will be a form of dishonesty. The B-29 was the most expensive weapons program in American history, surpassing even the atomic bomb project it eventually delivered. It killed in numbers that staggered the conscience. It ended a war that, by every calculation available to the men who ran it, would have killed far more people had it continued. What does it mean to make a decision that saves lives by taking them? And who gets to make that decision, and by what authority, and at what cost to their own humanity? These are not questions the history of the B-29 answers. They are questions the history of the B-29 leaves permanently, uncomfortably open for every generation that inherits the world that weapon made.